At the dawn of October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, 10 men walked one by one toward a gallows of 13 steps. Outside, the ruined city slept under the weight of 11 years of horror. Inside, the smell of new wood and freshly applied lime filled the space where hours before the condemned had eaten their last supper: sausages, potato salad, black bread, and tea. Some prayed, one made a speech, another shouted anti-Semitic slogans until the last second, and one, the most powerful of all, was no longer there to be hanged. He had died alone, in his cell, with glass crystals between his lips and cyanide in his blood. No one has ever explained how he obtained the poison. These trials changed the history of humanity. They created the modern concept of war crime. They established that obeying orders does not exempt one from criminal responsibility, and they left open for decades 20 questions that their protagonists took to the grave. This is what is known, and this is what is not known. The night of October 15, 1946, at approximately 22:45 hours, the guard on duty in cell number 5 of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice noticed that Reichsmarshal Hermann Wilhelm Göring had stopped moving. He called the corporal of the guard. When they entered, they found him convulsing. The doctor arrived minutes later. Göring was already dead. On his lips were fragments of glass. In his mouth, traces of potassium cyanide. 2 hours later, 10 of his fellow convicts were walking toward the scaffold. Göring, ex-commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, former number 2 of the Reich after Hitler, sentenced to death on 4 counts of the indictment on October 1, 1946, had evaded the gallows, and the question the Allies asked themselves that dawn was immediate, urgent, and never fully answered. How? The Nuremberg Palace of Justice was no ordinary prison. The 22 defendants lived in cells of approximately 3 meters by 4. Each cell had an observation slit in the door through which guards looked every 30 seconds. Prisoners slept with their hands outside the blanket. They had no belts, laces, or anything that could serve to take one's own life. They had been searched upon entry. Their belongings were inspected. Visits were conducted with guards present. The United States Army, which was responsible for security, reached 3 different conclusions over the years. None was entirely satisfactory. The most immediate official version maintained that Göring had hidden the cyanide vial inside a jar of hair cream from the moment of his capture, on May 6, 1945. Göring himself left 2 letters, one addressed to the Allied tribunal, where he declared that he would have accepted a firing squad, but was not going to allow them to hang him like a common criminal. He invoked the example of the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who committed suicide with poison before falling into the hands of Rome. The second letter, addressed to the prison commander Colonel Burton C. Andrus, exonerated all guards of any responsibility and stated that the poison had been in his possession from the beginning, hidden at various times in his gastrointestinal tract or behind the rim of the toilet in his cell. The problem with this version is that Göring remained in Allied custody for more than 16 months. If he had the cyanide from the beginning, why did he wait until the eve of the execution? The prison psychologist, Dr. Gustav Mark Gilbert, whose daily notes on the defendants constitute one of the most valuable documents of the period, recorded in his diary that Göring had a histrionic and theatrical personality, perfectly capable of planning a spectacular suicide for the most dramatic moment. But he also noted his doubts. Someone with sufficient access to introduce a second jar of cream into the cell could have introduced the poison. The second theory emerged decades later. In 2005, the Los Angeles Times published the confession of Herbert Lee Stivers, who in 1946 was 19 years old and served as a guard in Nuremberg. Stivers stated that a young German woman seduced him and asked him to carry messages inside a fountain pen to Göring's cell. The third time he did it, she told him the pen contained medicine for the Reichsmarshal. Stivers carried out the task without suspecting anything. When Göring died that night, the young guard understood. He kept silent for almost 6 decades for fear of the consequences. The military investigation never confirmed or denied Stivers' version. The fact that he served in that prison is verified. The names of the two men who supposedly orchestrated the operation, whom Stivers remembered as Eric and Matthias, were never identified. The young woman neither. Historian Michael Maris from the University of Toronto summarized it in 2005 with precision. Stivers' story is barely plausible. That, in all certainty, we will never know. What did remain documented was the scene of that night. Lieutenant Gene P. Willis was the first officer to arrive at the cell. His daughter, years later, remembered that her father always mentioned the glass fragments he saw on the dead man's lips. Potassium cyanide destroys cells by preventing them from absorbing oxygen. Death can occur in a matter of seconds, or it can take minutes of agony. In Goering's body, the doctors found 2 more vials in the cream jar, exactly as he had described. The official investigation accepted its own explanation. Goering died as he had lived, dominating the scene. Those who knew him knew he would have planned that end with the same meticulousness with which he planned his hunts at Karinhall, his mansion 80 kilometers northeast of Berlin. He preferred death by his own choice to death by the decision of others. What no one could explain with certainty was how. And that detail, the most crucial of all, remains without answer. When Rudolf Hess took his seat in the dock on November 20, 1945, the first day of the trial, he had been in British custody for 4 years. His solo flight to Scotland on May 10, 1941, in a modified Messerschmitt Bf 110 that he piloted himself for almost 1,000 kilometers from Augsburg to the outskirts of Glasgow, was one of the most inexplicable episodes of the Second World War. And now, sitting between Goering and Ribbentrop, Hess stared ahead with eyes sunken in a grey face and seemed to remember nothing. Dr. Gustav Gilbert, the prison psychologist, described him in his notes from the early days with these words. He sat in his cell in a state of stupor with his gaze fixed on nowhere. He ate mechanically. He did not recognize Goering when the latter approached him during recesses. He was asked on several occasions about people and events he had known intimately, and he responded with total indifference. The problem was that Hess had faked amnesia before. The tribunal took note of this. In its final judgment, the document of October 1, 1946, the judges recognized that Hess acted in an abnormal manner and that his memory had deteriorated during the trial, but concluded that nothing indicated he did not understand the charges against him or that he was incapable of defending himself. His lawyer, Alfred Seidel, conducted a competent defense. Hess was found guilty on counts 1 and 2, conspiracy and crimes against peace, and sentenced to life imprisonment. But the question of whether his amnesia was real, feigned, or a mixture of both ran through the trial from beginning to end. In December 1945, a psychiatric commission formed by representatives of the 4 Allied countries examined Hess for several days. Their conclusions were that the defendant suffered from hysterical amnesia, but that this condition did not make him legally insane or incapable of understanding what was happening around him. The key word was hysterical, an amnesia of psychological origin, not neurological, which could be unconscious or deliberate, and which in any case did not eliminate criminal responsibility. Then something happened that complicated the picture even further. On November 30, 1945, while the trial was just beginning, Hess read a statement aloud before the tribunal. He announced that his amnesia had been feigned, that in reality he remembered everything perfectly, that he had done it for tactical reasons. And during the following weeks he seemed to confirm this announcement. He recognized Goering, recognized documents, participated in coherent conversations. But then gradually, the fog returned. Toward the end of the trial, Hess seemed as lost as at the beginning. Gilbert noted in his diary that this was the 3rd recovery of his memory, and that no one in the room knew what to believe. Gilbert himself, who had unrestricted access to all cells and spoke daily with the defendants, recorded a revealing scene. Goering, in one of his sessions in the cell, asked Gilbert if he thought Hess was faking. Gilbert replied that it was difficult to know. Goering limited himself to saying that Hess had flown off to England without papers, without instructions, without anything. He left a note of a lunatic, and that he, Göring, did not know what to think either. The question extended beyond the trial. Hess was sent to Spandau prison in Berlin in July 1947, along with 6 other convicts from the main trial. With the passing of years, while his fellow convicts were being released, Hess became the sole prisoner of a complex designed for 600 people. The 4 victorious countries, United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, rotated his custody every month. The annual cost of maintaining a single old man in that 19th-century Prussian fortress was, according to estimates from the 1980s, over $1 million. Hess remained there for 40 years. Petitions for humanitarian clemency, arguing his age and physical deterioration, were systematically rejected by the Soviets. In 1987, he was 93 years old, had severe arthritis, and could barely walk. On August 17, 1987, he was found dead in the summer house in the prison garden. An electric cord detached from a reading lamp was around his neck. The official version was suicide. But there another mystery within the mystery arose. Abdallah Melouhi, his Tunisian nurse since 1982, stated in a BBC broadcast in February 1989 that when he arrived at the summer house, everything was in disorder. The cord was in its usual place, still plugged into the wall, and there were 2 American soldiers in uniform at the site. His son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, claimed that his father had been murdered to prevent him from revealing something about his 1941 flight. A doctor who examined the cadaver pointed out that a 93-year-old man with severe arthritis would have had enormous difficulty strangling himself in that manner. The British government rejected all these theories. In 2019, researchers from the Walter Reed Army Medical Centers and the University of Salzburg published in the journal Forensic Science International a DNA analysis of the only known biological sample of prisoner number 7 of Spandau compared with DNA from a male relative of Hess. The match was 99.99%. The man who died in Spandau in August 1987 was Rudolf Hess. The double theory was discarded by science. What no DNA analysis could resolve was whether the death was suicide or murder, if the amnesia was real or acted, and exactly what Hess wanted to tell Churchill in 1941 when he landed in the fields of Scotland with a peace message that the British never fully revealed to the public. On May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess, deputy to the Führer, third man of the Reich, the highest-ranking official in the Nazi Party, after Hitler and Göring took off from Augsburg airfield in a modified Messerschmitt Bf 110D. The plane carried additional fuel tanks for long-distance flight. Hess had practiced in secret on that model for months, convincing Messerschmitt technicians that the flights were purely sporting. He flew alone for approximately 900 kilometers over the North Sea and Scottish territory, without escort and without communicating his destination to anyone. At 23:09 hours, he landed by parachute near Eaglesham Farm in the county of Renfrewshire, about 20 kilometers from Glasgow. His declared objective was to meet with the Duke of Hamilton, whom he had briefly met at the Berlin Olympic Games of 1936, to transmit a peace proposal between Germany and Great Britain. Hitler, upon learning the next day, flew into a rage. He issued an official statement describing Hess as a mentally ill person who had acted on his own against the Führer's instructions. This statement served to protect the German government from any diplomatic interpretation of the flight. But the question that historians have debated since then is how much Hitler really knew. In the Nuremberg trial, the tribunal received documents showing that Hess had prepared the flight for weeks. He had left letters for his wife Ilse and his closest collaborators. He had drafted a memorandum with the peace proposals he intended to transmit. The logistics of the flight, the modified fuel tanks, the route studied with cartographic precision, the previous contacts he tried to establish with the circle of the Duke of Hamilton indicated an operation that required time and resources. Could all that have happened under Hitler's nose without him knowing? Göring, in his conversations with Gilbert in the cell, was evasive but revealing. He told him that Hess had simply gone, without papers, without instructions, leaving a note of a madman, and that he, as Hitler's designated successor after Hess's departure, knew nothing of the matter. But then he added something that Gilbert noted with care, that Hess had taken with him certain peace proposals, and that if the mission had succeeded, he would have received the Nobel Peace Prize. The British archives covering the interrogation of Hess in London in 1941 remained classified for decades. When they were finally declassified throughout the 1990s and 2000s, they did not reveal any direct instruction from Hitler for the flight, but they also did not prove that Hitler was completely unaware of his deputy's plans. Historian John Harris and investigative journalist Richard Wilborn argued in a work published in 2011 that there were indications that British intelligence had set a trap for Hess, making him believe there was a faction in Great Britain favourable to peace with Germany ready to negotiate. If this was true, the flight was a disinformation operation into which Hess fell because someone in his circle, or he himself, was manipulated. What the Nuremberg trial established clearly was that the flight did not exempt Hess from criminal responsibility. The crimes against peace he committed predated May 1941. The signing of decrees that extended the Nuremberg laws to Austria, the creation of special punishment systems for Poles and Jews in the occupied territories, and his active participation in the preparation of the war of aggression were proven by documents with his signature. But what Hess knew and never said about the flight, about the negotiations, about who else was aware, is a void that the declassified archives did not entirely fill. The International Military Tribunal tried him in absentia. He was the only defendant of the main process whom no one had seen in months. On April 30, 1945, hours after Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the Führerbunker under the Reich Chancellery, Berlin was burning and the Red Army controlled almost every neighborhood in the city. Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, the man whom historians have described as the Führer's shadow and the guardian of his access, tried to escape. What occurred after that night of May 2, 1945, was a matter of debate for nearly 3 decades. Several witnesses claimed to have seen him alive in the following months. A driver of Hitler, Erich Kempke, testified before the tribunal on July 3, 1946, that he had seen Bormann wounded by the explosion of a Soviet tank on the Weidendammer Bridge over the Spree River. The leader of the Hitler Youth, Arthur Axmann, who also escaped from the bunker that night, claimed to have seen the lifeless bodies of Bormann and Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, under the moonlight near Lehrter Station, north of the city. Axmann said he had touched them and verified they were dead. But in November 1945, when the tribunal decided whether to try Bormann in absentia, no physical proof of his death existed. The United States Army put a price on his head. Allied intelligence agencies received dozens of reports claiming to have seen him in different countries: Spain, Argentina, Paraguay, Egypt. Operation Paperclip, which moved Nazi scientists and technicians to work for the American government, generated additional suspicions about whether Bormann had also been absorbed by some Western agency. The tribunal found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity on October 1, 1946, and sentenced him to death in absentia. The text of the sentence added that if Bormann was not dead and was subsequently captured, the Allied Control Council could review his case and reduce the sentence if extenuating circumstances existed. Decades passed. Reports on Bormann in Argentina fueled books, movies, and theories. Argentine intelligence, according to documents declassified in January 2026, tried to follow several leads during the 1950s and 60s, but each ended in false positives, sensationalist press reports, and erroneous arrests of people who had no relationship with the Nazi leader. The resolution arrived in the most prosaic way possible, with a shovel. In December 1972, during construction work near Lehrter Station in Berlin, exactly where Axmann had said he saw the cadavers in 1945, workers discovered 2 skeletons. Forensic analysis compared the remains with known dental records of Bormann and confirmed the identity. West German authorities officially declared him dead in 1973. But the skeptics were not satisfied. In 1998, a DNA analysis of those same bones using DNA samples provided by a son of Bormann confirmed the identity with a probability of 99.99%. Martin Bormann died trying to escape from Berlin on May 2, 1945. His body remained buried in Berlin soil for 27 years, while the world searched for him on the Argentine pampas. His ashes were scattered over the Baltic Sea in 1999. The only mystery that persists is that of the assets. Bormann controlled the Nazi Party money. He supervised the transfer of enormous sums to accounts abroad during the final years of the war. Part of that money was never traced, where it went, who received it, and if any fraction of it financed the escape networks of other war criminals, are questions that available archives still do not answer with precision. Göring, in his conversations with Gilbert during the trial, was strikingly direct about Bormann. He said he was a nobody sustained only by the Führer, that if he had taken power, he would have gotten rid of Bormann in 5 minutes, that Himmler would have taken a few more weeks. The contempt Göring felt for him was real, but so was the power Bormann had accumulated in the final years of the Reich. A power built on the control of access to the Führer, on the handling of correspondence and decrees, on the ability to decide who spoke with Hitler and who did not. Martin Bormann was sentenced to death. He died before he could be executed. And the tribunal that condemned him knew it only years later. Dr. Gustav Mark Gilbert arrived in Nuremberg in October 1945 with the rank of captain in the United States Army and a precise mandate to evaluate the mental fitness of the defendants to appear before the tribunal. But Gilbert, who was a psychologist trained at Columbia and New York universities, saw in that situation an unprecedented opportunity in the history of psychology, unrestricted access to the leaders of the movement that had produced the Holocaust. Were they monsters biologically distinct from the rest of humanity? Or were they normal men who had made extraordinarily perverse decisions? To answer that question, he needed data. He began with intelligence tests. Gilbert used his own German version of the Wechsler-Bellevue intelligence test for adults, eliminating the culturally biased parts vocabulary and general knowledge, and retaining the sections on memory, arithmetic, reasoning, and sensory-motor coordination. The results, which he published in his book Nuremberg Diary, published in 1947, produced a surprise that he himself acknowledged. With one single exception, all the defendants showed an intelligence above average. The table that appears in the book is revealing. Hjalmar Schacht, the Reich's banker, led the list with an intelligence quotient of 143. He was followed by Arthur Seyss-Inquart with 141. Hermann Göring obtained 138, tied with Karl Dönitz. Franz von Papen reached 134, same as Admiral Erich Raeder. Hans Frank and Hans Fritzsche had 130 each, along with Baldur von Schirach. Joachim von Ribbentrop and Wilhelm Keitel obtained 129. Albert Speer recorded 128. Alfred Jodl and Alfred Rosenberg, 127. Konstantin von Neurath, 125. Walter Funk, 124. Wilhelm Frick, also 124. Rudolf Hess obtained 120, although Gilbert indicated that this was an estimated result based on a review after his recovery from amnesia. Fritz Sauckel reached 118. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, 113. And Julius Streicher, the most virulent anti-Semite of the Third Reich, recorded the lowest score of all the defendants, 106, just above average. Gilbert took care to warn in his book that the test measures only the mechanical efficiency of the mind, that nothing in those numbers had to do with moral character, personal values, or the decisions each one had made. High intelligence does not protect against evil. Sometimes it powers it. But what the numbers revealed was something that made many uncomfortable. The most powerful war criminals of 20th century history were more intelligent than the average citizen. The argument that Nazism was the work of irrational and ignorant fanatics found no support in that Nuremberg room. What the tests could not measure was what Gilbert tried to capture with projective tests, the Rorschach tests and the thematic apperception test. The results of these tests were more complex and more debated. Gilbert described Göring's reaction to the Rorschach inkblot test in detail. When the psychologist showed him the plate that frequently evokes the image of blood, Göring hesitated. Then he tried to wipe it with his finger, as if he wanted to erase it. Gilbert interpreted this gesture as a manifestation of the denial that had characterized the Reichsmarshal's conduct throughout the trial. Every time the evidence of his crimes became unbearable, Göring would take off his translation headphones, look away, or make some small gesture to push the horror away from his consciousness. The same, in miniature, with the red stain of the Rorschach test. Decades later, in 1975, researchers from the University of Michigan analyzed the full results of the Rorschach tests of the Nuremberg defendants. The documents had survived in archives and concluded that the profiles did not correspond to any uniform psychopathological category. The defendants did not share a common personality structure that distinguished them from the rest of humanity. They were, in clinical terms, normal people. That was exactly what Gilbert had concluded in 1947, and that was what made the question become darker. If they were intelligent, if they were clinically normal, then the decisions they made were chosen, deliberate, their own. The mystery that the tests left open was that of responsibility without pathology, horror without neurological excuse. On October 1, 1946, when the president of the tribunal, Lord Justice Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, read the verdicts of the 21 defendants who remained in the dock, Robert Ley had already died before the trial. 3 names produced a shock that spread from the Nuremberg courtroom to the Allied headquarters in Berlin and the editorials of the world's newspapers. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, Franz von Papen, and Hans Fritzsche, acquitted. Soviet judge Iona Nikitchenko dissented formally and in writing. For him, the 3 should have been convicted. His dissent was incorporated into the record of the trial. The case of Schacht was the most striking. He had been president of the German Reichsbank, Minister of Economics, and the financial architect of Germany's rearmament in the 1930s. Without the financing mechanisms that Schacht designed, the so-called Mefo-Wechsel, promissory notes issued in the name of a fictitious company to hide military spending, Nazi Germany would not have been able to rearm at the speed it did. Schacht had personally brought Hitler together with the main German industrialists in February 1933 to finance the NSDAP's election campaign. 3 million marks flowed into the party's coffers that night. But the tribunal concluded that the inference that Schacht knew of Hitler's aggressive plans could not be established beyond reasonable doubt. Schacht had been removed from his post in 1937 when he began to oppose the rate of armament spending. In July 1944, after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, he was arrested and sent to the Dachau concentration camp. He arrived in Nuremberg as an accused of war crimes, but with the background of having been a Nazi prisoner. Schacht, who during the trial was the most certain of his own innocence among all the defendants and manifested this to Gilbert in multiple conversations in his cell, walked out of the prison that afternoon without a second thought. And almost immediately he was arrested again by the German denazification authorities, who sentenced him to 8 years in a labor camp, although he only served 2 before being acquitted in the second instance. Franz von Papen, vice-chancellor during the first months of Hitler's government in 1933, was the man who convinced President Paul von Hindenburg to name Hitler Chancellor of the Reich in January of that year. The British prosecution argued that von Papen had done more than anyone except Hitler himself to consolidate Nazi power. The tribunal estimated that his participation in the specifically defined crimes had not been sufficiently proven. Hans Fritzsche was the deputy director of propaganda under Joseph Goebbels and head of the radio division of the ministry. The Soviets had arrested him in Berlin and handed him over to Nuremberg to be tried. The prosecution maintained that his radio broadcasts had incited racial hatred and psychologically prepared the German population to accept the crimes. The tribunal acquitted him upon finding insufficient proof that his broadcasts directly constituted a war crime. The 3 acquitted men left the prison on the afternoon of October 1, 1946. A phalanx of Nuremberg police surrounded them immediately to prevent them from being lynched. They remained in their former cells for 3 more days of their own free will before venturing outside. The debate over whether these acquittals were justified or not has never ceased. American Judge Francis Biddle, according to later documents, had serious doubts about the acquittal of Schacht and von Papen, but accepted the consensus of the tribunal. What Gilbert recorded in his diary was the reaction of the other prisoners. Frank, the former Governor-General of Poland who had been sentenced to death and who in the last months of the trial had converted fervently to Catholicism, laughed out loud upon learning that the acquitted were harassed by the Germans themselves at the prison exit. He told Gilbert that they, the condemned, were the only free ones, that there is no freedom from Hitlerism for anyone. It was one of the few phrases of the trial that no one quite knew how to interpret. Before the main trial began, on November 20, 1945, there was already one death. Robert Ley, born on February 15, 1890 in Niederbreidenbach in the Prussian Rhineland, had been the head of the German Labour Front since 1933, controlling an organisation of 25 million members. Under his direction, free trade unions were dissolved, their funds confiscated, their leaders imprisoned. The German Labour Front became the regime's instrument of control over the German working class. The Allies captured him on May 16, 1945, in the mountains near Berchtesgaden, where he had taken refuge in the final days of the collapse. He was indicted on counts 1, 3, and 4, conspiracy to commit war crimes proper, and crimes against humanity. On October 18, 1945, Ley received the text of the indictment in his cell. 4 days later, on October 25, 1945, on Tuesday afternoon, the guard on duty noticed that Ley had been motionless in the same position for some time. He opened the cell. Ley had torn the hem of a towel, wet it, twisted it until it was strong and tied it to the flush pipe of the toilet. He had stuffed strips of underwear into his mouth, apparently so he could not scream. Then he had sat on the floor with the improvised rope around his neck until strangulation produced unconsciousness. The prison doctor, Dr. Ludwig Flücker, tried to resuscitate him for 20 minutes. He did not succeed. Ley was 55 years old. Dr. Douglas Kelly, the prison psychiatrist during the first months before Gilbert took over the psychologist position, who already suspected damage to Ley's frontal lobe due to his frequent and incoherent eruptions, had, as he related later, a peculiar reaction. He declared that Ley had done him a personal favor. Ley's brain was the only one Kelly suspected would have organic damage. A colleague extracted the brain from the cadaver and sent it surreptitiously to Washington, where neuropathologist Webb Haymaker from the Army Institute of Pathology examined it. He found evidence of minor pathological changes, but not enough to establish legal incapacity. What Ley took to the grave was considerable. As head of the Labour Front, he knew the inner mechanisms of forced labour recruitment, the agreements between the party apparatus and private industry, and the operational details of the network that fed the war factories with enslaved workers. He was, along with Fritz Sauckel, one of the 2 men most directly involved in the system of labour exploitation that kept the German war industry functioning. Gilbert noted that the other prisoners reacted with little mourning. Goering commented that Ley had always been a drunk who was killing himself anyway. Streicher, the only one who had maintained some relationship with Ley during the previous internment at the Mondorf camp in Luxembourg, called him a coward for having committed suicide. The rest dismissed him with a gesture. Colonel Burton C. Andrews, the prison commander, took immediate measures. He quadrupled the guard, placed a permanent sentry in front of each cell 24 hours a day. For reasons he did not explain immediately, he did not inform the rest of the prisoners of the exact method Ley had used to kill himself, fearful of giving them ideas. But the first suicide was not the only question. Also left open was that of Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the industrial tycoon from Essen who had financed the rearmament, who had used slave labor in his foundries, and who appeared, in the original indictment. Krupp did not reach the dock because a medical examination determined that his physical and mental deterioration made him incapable of undergoing trial. The Allies tried to substitute him with his son Alfred, but the tribunal rejected the change, arguing that trying someone in place of another was contrary to the basic principles of justice. The Krupp family continued running their businesses. Alfred Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach would be tried and convicted in one of the subsequent Nuremberg Trials in 1948, though he was released in 1951 after a pardon from the American High Commissioner John J. McCloy. On October 16, 1946, at 1:11 in the morning, Joachim von Ribbentrop entered the gymnasium of the Palace of Justice, where 2 wooden gallows had been installed. He was the first of the 10 condemned. His hands were tied with a leather strap behind his back. He climbed the 13 steps of the first gallows. Below the platform, invisible to the witnesses, was Staff Sergeant John C. Woods from Wichita, Kansas, the official executioner of the United States Army for the Third Army region. Ribbentrop pronounced his last words. The trapdoor fell. And there the problem began. Ribbentrop took 10 minutes to die. What should have been an instantaneous fracture of the cervical vertebrae, the death in seconds that a correctly designed gallows produces, became a slow strangulation. Several reporters present, including Kingsbury Smith from International News Service, whose account was published on the front page of newspapers worldwide on the same October 16th, described that from behind the canvas curtains covering the space under the gallows, groans were heard for minutes. Julius Streicher, the most rabid anti-Semite of the Reich, publisher of Der Stürmer, was the 7th to die that dawn. While he climbed the steps, he shouted slogans and curses in German. When the trapdoor fell, Smith wrote that groans were heard from inside the structure. According to Lieutenant Stanley Tills, in charge of coordinating the executions, Woods had deliberately placed the coils of Streicher's knot off-center to ensure he did not die quickly. Smith, who observed Woods closely during the entire operation, believed that the executioner hated the Germans and had enjoyed what he did. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the Chief of Staff of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, took, according to some reports, up to 24 minutes to die. The trapdoor was too small. Several of the condemned hit their heads or shoulders against the edges as they fell, which produced visible lacerations when the cadavers were taken down. Was all this accidental or deliberate? Woods had presented himself to the army during the war as an experienced executioner who had executed hundreds of people. It was a lie. Before Nuremberg, there is no verifiable record of him having performed a single execution. He had been dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Navy in 1930, diagnosed as psychopathic. Then he re-enlisted in the army as a combat engineer. When the military authorities looked for an executioner for the Nuremberg executions, Woods volunteered and fabricated a resume that no one verified in time. The army publicly denied that the process had been defective. An internal medical inspection of the executions was described by those who had access to it as revealing a disaster. But that report was never published. Woods stated after the executions with apparent pride, "I hanged those 10 Nazis and I'm proud of it. I wasn't nervous. A man can't afford to be nervous." In 1950, 4 years after Nuremberg, Woods died electrocuted while repairing equipment on a military base in the Marshall Islands. He was 39 years old. The central mystery of the executions of October 16, 1946 is not whether the men who died deserved their fate. That debate has an answer documented in 50,000 pages of judicial records. The question that remains without a definitive answer is whether there was a deliberate decision to make the condemned suffer, or if everything was a consequence of the incompetence of a man who lied to get the job. And if it was deliberate, who ordered it? On August 31, 1946, the last day the defendants were given the floor, Albert Speer delivered a speech before the tribunal that would separate him forever from his fellow dockmates. He was the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, the architect who had become the industrial motor of the German war machine. Under his management, German armaments production tripled between 1942 and 1944, despite Allied bombing. To achieve this, he used slave labor on a massive scale. it is estimated that nearly 12 million forced laborers passed through the system he coordinated with Fritz Sauckel. But Speer declared before the tribunal that he did not know of the Holocaust. The judges listened to him for days. Speer recognized his responsibility for slave labor. He accepted that he should have known more than he said he knew. He condemned the Nazi regime and Hitler with language that none of his fellow accused was willing to use. He presented himself as the technocrat who had served the system without understanding how far the system went. American Judge Francis Biddle wanted the death penalty for Speer. He argued that as Sauckel's hierarchical superior who was sentenced to the gallows precisely for the forced recruitment of workers, Speer was at least equally responsible. After 2 days of tense deliberations between the judges, the tribunal imposed 20 years of imprisonment on him. What the judges did not know in 1946 was the actual extent of Speer's knowledge about the Holocaust, or perhaps they did not want to know. In 1971, Gitta Serini, a journalist of Hungarian origin based in Great Britain, began a series of conversations with Speer that would span years and culminate in the book Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth, published in 1995. Serini demonstrated, based on testimonies and documents, that Speer had attended a conference by Heinrich Himmler in October 1943 in Posen, during which the head of the SS spoke with total frankness about the extermination of European Jews in front of a group of Reich leaders. The conference was recorded. The recording survived. Speer insisted for decades that he had not heard that part of Himmler's speech, that he had arrived late or left early. Serini concluded that this claim was improbable. She also pointed out that several documents showed that Speer received reports on conditions in concentration camps, including the Mauthausen camp where he personally visited the facilities. But in 1946, none of those documents were available to the prosecution with enough clarity to prove before the tribunal standard that Speer specifically knew about the extermination. Speer left Spandau in 1966 after serving his full 20 years. He wrote 2 memoirs that became international bestsellers. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in London on September 1, 1981, while giving an interview to the BBC Dutch journalist Dan van der Vat in his book The Good Nazi, published in 1997, synthesized the paradox. Speer was the most successful war criminal of Nuremberg. He managed to be judged for what he admitted instead of for what he hid. He built a narrative of repentance that Western judges found more manageable than the brutal denial of his companions. And he survived to tell his own version of history that sold millions of copies. The mystery of Speer is not whether he was guilty. It is why the tribunal believed him when no one else in that dock was believed. The Duke of Hamilton, the man whom Hess intended to meet that night in May 1941, visited him at Maryhill Castle, where he was taken after his capture the day after the landing. The Duke interrogated him for hours. Hess laid out his peace proposals. Germany had no interest in destroying the British Empire. He wanted Great Britain to withdraw from the war and recognize German hegemony over continental Europe. In exchange, Hitler would renounce any territorial claims over British colonial possessions. The Duke of Hamilton submitted a report to Winston Churchill. Churchill, according to records from that time, read the report in his bed, smoking a cigar, with an amused expression. He did not give much importance to the proposal. What followed was more complex. Hess remained in British custody until the end of the war. He was treated in several hospitals and castles, some of which were never fully documented in public archives. British intelligence MI5 and MI6 interrogated him repeatedly. Part of those transcripts remained classified for decades. When they were finally declassified, they revealed nothing that contradicted the official narrative, but neither did they explain why the British government had kept the secret about them for so long. The theory that Hess was lured to Scotland through a British disinformation operation that agents of MI6 or the Special Operations Executive had created the illusion of a peace faction within the English government ready to negotiate with Hitler was formulated by several historians, including documentarian John Harris. If this theory was correct, Hess was not a lunatic who acted on his own, but the target of an intelligence operation that made him believe his mission had a chance of success. Before the Nuremberg Tribunal, the judges determined that the flight should be considered the last of the crimes against peace committed by Hess. His objective had been to facilitate the aggression against the Soviet Union by temporarily removing Great Britain from the conflict. This interpretation was adopted by the Soviet judges with particular emphasis. But the letters Hess left on the day of his flight, the documents he carried with him on the plane, and the peace memorandums he drafted during his captivity in Great Britain were never published in their entirety. The British government argued for years national security reasons for keeping them reserved. What was documented by Gilbert was Hess's attitude at the trial. When the tribunal asked him in November 1945 if he had anything to say about his flight to Scotland, Hess replied that he remembered nothing. When in December he announced that his amnesia was feigned, he gave no explanation about the flight that contradicted the version he had been giving for months. And when at the end of the trial, in his final statement on August 31, 1946, he spoke before the tribunal in a speech that his companions described as deranged, he also revealed nothing concrete. The flight of Hess remains one of the most inexplicable acts of the Second World War. A man who was nominally the third most powerful of the Reich decided, for some reason that the available archives do not fully explain, to get on a modified military plane and fly alone, at night, toward a country with which Germany was at war, with a peace message that no one in London expected and that no one took seriously. The tribunal had before it a request from the prosecution that went beyond individuals to declare as criminal organizations the Reich Cabinet, the General Staff and the High Command of the Armed Forces, OKW, in addition to the SS, the SD, the Gestapo, the Leadership Corps of the NSDAP and the SA. Of these 7 organizations, 3 were declared criminal, the SS, the SD and the Gestapo. 4 were not, the Reich Cabinet, the General Staff, and the OKW and the SA. The acquittal of the General Staff and the OKW was one of the most controversial decisions of the trial. Soviet Judge Nikitchenko recorded his express dissent in a long document annexed to the sentence, arguing that it was impossible to separate the staff officers from the crimes of the regime they had served faithfully and executed with precision. He pointed out that it was not accidental that at the head of the Luftwaffe was Göring, that Hitler's designated successor was Dönitz, and that the Chief of Staff of the army was Keitel, who personally signed the orders for the execution of prisoners of war. The position of the Western judges was that the General Staff and the OKW were not organizations in the technical sense that the London Charter required for their declaration as criminal. They did not have a voluntary associative structure or formal membership. They were instead groups of officers who performed functions in the chain of command. Several historians have pointed out that this technical distinction proved convenient in the context of the Cold War that was already looming on the horizon. The Western Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, were beginning to consider the possibility of rearming West Germany as a counterweight to Soviet expansion. Declaring the German General Staff as a whole criminal would have enormously complicated any future German military reconstruction plans. The Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949. The Bundeswehr, the new West German army, began to form in 1955. Several of its first officers had served in the Wehrmacht. If the decision not to declare the General Staff criminal was influenced by geopolitical considerations already emerging in 1946, the Nuremberg trial would have been in part an instrument of post-war politics as much as an exercise in justice. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Reich Minister of Foreign Affairs between 1938 and 1945, was possibly the most despised defendant in the dock, not by the judges or the prosecution, but by his own companions. Göring called him a fool and ignorant. Schacht considered him an imbecile. Even Gilbert, who tried to maintain a neutral professional attitude, noted in his diary that Ribbentrop lacked any identifiable ideological coherence. In his cell, Ribbentrop spent his days consulting everyone who had access to him, doctors, guards, nurses, the barber, the German prison doctor, on how he should construct his defense. The German prison doctor told Gilbert, with mockery, that if there had been a janitor, Ribbentrop would also have asked him for advice on Nazi foreign policy. During the trial, Ribbentrop proved erratic. His statements were long, repetitive, and frequently contradicted documents that the prosecution had presented with his own signature. He seemed genuinely incapable of remembering meetings or decisions that he himself had recorded in official reports. Either his memory was as defective as Hess's, or there was something more complex behind that chaos. Gilbert tried to understand what had driven Ribbentrop, a wine merchant with aristocratic contacts but without diplomatic or military training, to become the foreign minister of the greatest military power in modern history. His psychological profile described him as someone without his own convictions, whose identity had been built entirely on the projection of another's power. When Hitler died, Ribbentrop disintegrated. What Gilbert could never determine with certainty was how much Ribbentrop knew about the final solution. The documents showed that diplomatic cables from his ministry had coordinated with other countries the delivery of Jews to German authorities. The prosecution presented several of those documents. Ribbentrop insisted that he had not understood the final destination of those people. The possibility that a foreign minister who signed cables about mass deportations did not know where those people were going was, for the judges, difficult to maintain. The tribunal found him guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced him to death. In the early morning of October 16, he was the first to enter the gymnasium. His last documented words were, "My God, have mercy on me. My last wish is that Germany's unity be preserved and that understanding between East and West bring peace to the world." He died after 10 minutes. 10. Douglas McGlashan Kelly was born in 1912 in Woodland, California, and arrived in Nuremberg in August 1945 as a major in the United States Army, in charge of evaluating the mental fitness of the defendants to appear before the tribunal. He was a young, ambitious psychiatrist with training in the area of projective personality tests. In Nuremberg, Kelly had unrestricted access to all defendants during the first months. His sessions with Goering were particularly extensive. According to the account by biographer Jack L. High, published in 2013 in the book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, the relationship between both men was more complex than that of doctor and patient. Goering found in Kelly someone intelligent enough to be worth trying to impress, and Kelly found in Goering a fascinating subject who resisted conventional clinical categories. When Kelly returned to the United States in early 1946, he had developed a thesis that would separate him from the consensus of his time. The Nazi leaders were not clinical psychopaths or mentally ill. They were people with personality profiles that could be found in any society, including American society. The problem was not biological or even psychological in the narrow sense of the term. It was cultural and systemic. This conclusion, which Kelly expressed in his book 22 Cells in Nuremberg, published in 1947, was uncomfortable for many people who preferred to believe that those responsible for the Holocaust were fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. Kelly built a successful career as a criminologist and public figure. He appeared on radio and television programs as an expert in criminal psychology. He was charismatic, brilliant, and liked to act under pressure. On January 1, 1958, during a family gathering at his home in Berkeley, California, Kelly put a cyanide capsule in his mouth in front of his wife and children and bit it. He died in the same way as Hermann Goering. His biographer L. High suggested that Kelly's suicide with cyanide was a deliberate evocation of Goering's death, a final statement by someone who had spent months studying a man who chose his own death with calculated theatricality. The historian pointed out that both men, so different in everything else, shared a characteristic: an aggressive intelligence combined with an inability to face certain forms of failure and shame. Kelly was 45 years old when he died. He left no note. The phenomenon of Rudolf Hess's amnesia was so striking that the tribunal itself decided to address it in its sentence with more detail than usual. The decision to declare him fit to be tried, despite his evident cognitive deterioration, was one of the most questioned of the process. During the first months of captivity in Great Britain between 1941 and 1945, Hess had shown erratic behaviors, conviction that he was being poisoned, suicide attempts, periods of deep lethargy alternating with episodes of apparent lucidity. When he arrived in Nuremberg in October 1945, he did not recognize people he had known intimately for years. The first recovery occurred on November 30, 1945, when Hess read before the tribunal his statement admitting that the amnesia had been feigned. The second was gradual, during January and February 1946, when he seemed capable of following the trial with greater coherence. The third happened in his final speech on August 31, 1946, when for a few minutes he seemed completely lucid before returning to his usual incoherences. Dr. Joel Dimsdale, a psychiatrist at the University of California, San Diego, published in 2021 a re-evaluation of the Nuremberg psychiatric reports. His conclusion about Hess was that he exhibited consistently abnormal behavior that extended over years, spanning events before, during, and even after the trial. Dimsdale retrospectively diagnosed a probable dissociative amnesia, a real disorder in which memory can be blocked and recovered in an apparently arbitrary manner under the effect of extreme stress. If Dimsdale was right, Hess was not completely faking. His amnesia was real, but it was also selective, and its selectivity could be interpreted both as a genuine psychological defense mechanism and as a conscious strategy for protection. What no psychiatric evaluation could determine was whether Hess used his real or feigned amnesia to avoid revealing information about German aggression plans that would have compromised other people, or to protect himself from the most serious charges. Gilbert, who observed him daily for almost a year, recorded a scene that summarizes Hess's ambiguity better than any clinical diagnosis. During a trial recess, while the defendants were having lunch at the court, Hess listened to Goering and Ribbentrop arguing heatedly about something both remembered with total clarity. Hess watched without participating, with a blank expression. When Gilbert approached and asked him what he thought, Hess limited himself to smiling mysteriously and said he knew why they had handcuffed him and not Goering. No one understood what he meant. The International Military Tribunal judged based on millions of pages of documents captured from German authorities during and after the war. It was a strategic decision by American prosecutor Robert H. Jackson to build the case on the Reich's own archives so that the process could not be discredited as a testimony of victors against vanquished. The strategy was extraordinarily effective, but the captured archives had holes. The most famous document presented before the tribunal was the Hossbach Memorandum, the record of a meeting Hitler convened on November 5, 1937, in which he laid out his aggression plans to Goering, von Blomberg, von Fritsch, Raeder, and von Neurath. The document was drafted by Hitler's adjutant, Colonel Friedrich Hossbach, 5 days after the meeting, and was captured by the Allies. It was the most direct evidence available that aggression plans existed and had been communicated to the military leadership before the war began. During the trial, some defendants questioned the authenticity of the memorandum. Jodl said he had not known of it in 1937. Seyss-Inquart said that if he had known of that document in 1937, they would have thought twice before going ahead. There were, however, other documents that the prosecution sought and did not find. The archives of the SD, the SS Security Service, which recorded the fate of hundreds of thousands of people who passed through the deportation system, were partially destroyed in the final weeks of the war. Some of the records from Auschwitz were burned. The record of personal correspondence between Hitler and some of his closest collaborators showed inexplicable gaps for certain periods. Was there a systematic destruction of compromising documents before the German capitulation? The answer is almost certainly yes. Albert Speer related in his memoirs that in the final days of the Reich, several of Hitler's collaborators begged him to burn volumes of documentation before they fell into Allied hands. He claimed to have refused. Others did not refuse. What the tribunal judged was the part of history that the captured documents told. The part that the destroyed documents would have told remains, by definition, in the dark. On July 20, 1944, a group of German officers placed a bomb at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. The conspirators were executed. Some of their names appeared in the Nuremberg trial because several witnesses mentioned them in statements about the internal resistance to the regime. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, had been a central figure of the internal resistance. He was arrested after the July 20 attempt, found hanged in the Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9, 1945, a few days before the end of the war. His diaries, which supposedly recorded his clandestine activities and his contacts with the Allies, were never found complete. General Erwin Lahausen, the most senior Abwehr officer who survived the war, testified before the Nuremberg Tribunal on November 30, 1945, in one of the most tense sessions of the trial. His testimony directly compromised Ribbentrop, Keitel and Jodl in orders for the murder of prisoners of war and undercover operations. Gilbert noted that while Lahausen was testifying, the defendants he mentioned could not hide their discomfort. But the question the trial did not address directly was how many of the defendants in the dock had had some level of contact with the internal resistance, not necessarily participating in it, but at least knowing about it, and how many of them could have acted differently if the resistance had been successful. Schacht claimed in his testimony that his arrest by the Nazis in July 1944 was related to his oppositional attitude to the war economic policy. The tribunal did not find sufficient evidence to convict him, but neither to grant him the status of resistant hero that he himself claimed. The mystery of how many people within the Reich apparatus knew of the crimes, how many could have resisted and why so few did so effectively, is a question that transcends the judicial process and touches the nature of conformism under totalitarian regimes. General Alfred Joseph Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, was sentenced to death on October 1, 1946, and hanged on October 16th of the same year. He was 56 years old. His last words pronounced at the foot of the gallows were, "I salute you, my Germany." 7 years later, in 1953, an arbitration board of the government of the Federal Republic of Germany retroactively examined Jodl's case. Its conclusion was that Jodl should be acquitted of all charges and that the Nuremberg conviction had been unjust. The German posthumous verdict was never recognized by any of the four Allied powers, but it put on the table an uncomfortable question. Was Jodl's conviction proportional to his actual responsibility? During the trial, Jodl's defense was that he had been an officer of pure military operations, a tactical planner without responsibility for occupation policies or the treatment of prisoners. The tribunal rejected this argument, pointing out that Jodl had signed or transmitted several of the regime's most brutal decrees, including orders authorizing the summary execution of guerrillas and the differentiated treatment of Soviet prisoners. Jodl had signed the German surrender in Reims on May 7, 1945, representing the German Supreme Command. It was one of the last acts of authority by the military leaders of the Reich. Months later, he was in the dock. What Jodl's case illustrates is the fundamental tension of the trial, the difficulty of establishing individual responsibility in a hierarchical system where orders came from above and obedience was absolute. The tribunal rejected the argument that following orders eliminated criminal responsibility, but the question of what the threshold of resistance was that could reasonably be demanded of a career military officer in the circumstances of the Third Reich did not find a uniform answer in the process. The fact that 7 years later a German court exonerated him posthumously without it producing any modification of the international historical record says something about the complexity of post-conflict justice. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was the name that headed the list of the original 24 defendants of the main process. Director of the Krupp companies, the industrial conglomerate from Essen that manufactured steel, armaments and warships for the Reich, he had financed the Nazi Party since 1932 and had used slave labor in his factories throughout the war. Prisoners of war, deportees from the occupied territories, inmates of concentration camps. But Gustav Krupp was 75 years old in 1945 and had suffered a stroke that had left him with severe dementia. A medical commission determined that he could not understand the charges or participate in his own defense. The tribunal excluded him from the process. The prosecution tried to substitute him with his son Alfred Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach, who had directed the company's operations during the war and was equally or more responsible for the crimes of which the father was accused. The tribunal rejected the substitution with an argument that was formally correct, but whose practical effect was to save Alfred Krupp from being tried in the main process. Alfred Krupp was subsequently tried in one of the 12 successive trials held by the American Military Tribunal between 1946 and 1949. In 1948, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison and the confiscation of his industrial properties. In 1951, the American High Commissioner John J. McCloy granted him amnesty, returned his properties, and Alfred Krupp resumed control of the companies. The McCloy case generated a controversy that is still discussed among jurists and historians. The amnesties that McCloy granted in 1951 to several convicts from the successive Nuremberg trials, including doctors who had performed experiments on human beings, SS officers and Alfred Krupp himself, were justified by American authorities with arguments that mixed humanitarian considerations with the geopolitical need to have a strong West Germany in the context of the Cold War. The mystery of why the most important industrial family of the Reich was substantially protected from the most serious legal consequences of its crimes has not received a definitive explanation. The arguments that oscillate between procedural incompetence, political convenience, and the corruption of the justice process by economic interests coexist without any being completely satisfactory. The Nuremberg trial produced some statements that surprised the defendants among themselves. One of the most impactful was that of Hans Frank. Frank, born in 1900 in Karlsruhe, had been Hitler's personal lawyer during the 1920s and 30s. With the occupation of Poland in 1939, he was named Governor-General of the Polish territory not incorporated into the Reich, with headquarters in Krakow. Under his administration, more than 3 million Polish Jews were murdered, as well as millions of non-Jewish Poles. Frank kept in his diary a document of 42 volumes that was captured complete by the Allies, detailed records of his own orders and deliberations. In the early months of the trial, Frank showed erratic behaviors. He tried to slit his wrists in his cell. The interrogators described him as elusive and hostile. But then something changed. Gilbert recorded in his diary on November 7, 1945, a conversation in the cell in which Frank told him that in the solitude of that room he had understood many things. That when he saw Goering, stripped of his decorations, reduced to that prisoner suit waiting for the trial in a cell with 4 walls and a toilet, he understood what power really was. That those who had believed they were serving the best of all ideals had actually served the beast itself. Frank ended the trial declaring himself fully guilty of the crimes attributed to him. On August 31, 1946, in his last speech before the tribunal, he did not seek extenuating circumstances. When he received the death sentence on October 1, he lowered his eyes and nodded softly. Upon learning that there were 11 sentenced to death, counting Goering, he quickly calculated how many he had expected, and he said he had counted 14. What Gilbert could never determine with certainty was how much of that conversion was real and how much was tactical. Frank had asked to be received by priests, had asked for confession, had asked for the sacraments. The American chaplain who attended him, Henry Gerecke, a Lutheran from Missouri who also attended Goering, considered that Frank's conversion was authentic and that Goering's was an act. Frank's conversion was, at least in the scene of that night before the execution, perfectly consistent with everything he had said and written in the previous months. But if it was real, since when had Frank known what he knew? When exactly had he understood that he was serving the beast? The 42 volumes of his diary suggest that he always knew. The Nuremberg trial generated a document that was not part of the indictment or the sentence, but which would become the ethical foundation of modern medicine, the Nuremberg Code. It was drafted in August 1947 At the conclusion of the doctor's trial, one of the 12 successive processes held by the American Military Tribunal, and established 10 principles for medical research with human beings. The first and most fundamental, the voluntary consent of the human subject, is absolutely essential. But the mystery is not in what the code says, it is in what it does 75 years after its publication. As demonstrated by Ken McCarthy, editor of the commemorative edition of the 75th anniversary published in August 2022, none of the institutions that should commemorate that anniversary did so. The American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, with nearly 1,800 members and its own annual convention, did not organize any event on the subject. The 10 American universities that lead in training in medical ethics, Harvard, Duke, Columbia, the University of Pennsylvania, Northwestern, Wake Forest, the University of Richmond, Creighton, Johns Hopkins, and Albany Medical College, did not publish any statement to that effect. The FDA, the CDC, and the NIH, which together employ more than 46,000 people, also did not produce any document or event that marked the date. The final mystery of the Nuremberg Trials may be this: that the most important process in the history of international justice, the one that established that crimes against humanity are crimes even if committed by states, the one that created Nuremberg law, and the one that generated the code that should protect every human being from being turned into an experimental subject without their consent, has produced a document that the medical world itself seems to have decided to forget. The code exists. Its 10 principles are clear and are written in a language that needs no interpretation. But its history, its origin in the horror of the cells of Dachau and Auschwitz, where Nazi doctors did experiments on living human beings, its weight as one of the few documents that the 20th century produced directly from the moral abyss, that history is not taught with the regularity and emphasis that it should be. The question of why it is not taught, of who benefits from it not being taught, and of whether the forgetting is deliberate or simply a form of institutional comfort, is the one that the Nuremberg Code leaves open. And that question, unlike the other 19 we have covered in this document, does not need declassified archives or DNA analysis to be answered. It only needs someone to ask it with sufficient clarity.